The move was supposed to be a fresh start. Elias, his wife Lillian, and their 7-year-old son Owen had outgrown their cramped apartment and found what seemed to be the perfect home in a quiet suburban neighborhood. It was an old house, sturdy, with a large backyard, a dream for Owen to play in. But the yard had a strange feature, a collection of weathered stone statues, cracked and covered in moss. Some stood tall, resembling people frozen in time, while others crouched low, twisted into unnatural shapes. The realtor had laughed when Elias asked about them. Just old garden decor from the previous owners. Adds character, don't you think? The first night passed without incident. They were exhausted from unpacking, and despite the eerie presence of the statues outside, sleep came easily. But the next morning, as Elias stepped out with his coffee, something was off. One of the statues had moved. It wasn't in the same spot as the night before. He was sure of it. A hunched figure that had been at the far end of the yard now stood closer, as if it had taken a step forward. Elias rubbed his eyes and chalked it up to exhaustion. Maybe he'd just remembered wrong. The following morning, another statue had shifted. This time, it was impossible to dismiss. It had moved across the yard, closer to the house. Lillian shrugged it off. Maybe Owen was playing with them. But Owen was too small to lift them. When asked, he only shook his head. "I didn't touch them, Daddy. I don't like them. They look at me." That night, Elias couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint rustling of trees outside. Just the wind, he told himself. Just the wind. But when he got up the next morning, his stomach clenched at the sight outside. The statues were lined up at the very edge of the house, facing inward, their cracked faces aimed at the windows. A chill crawled up his spine. Someone had to be moving them. A neighbor? A prankster? He tried to push them back, but they were heavy, too heavy. It would take multiple people to move just one. His hands trembled as he went inside. The real terror came the next night. Lillian shook him awake, her voice tight with fear. "Elias, someone's outside." He jumped up, heart hammering. They crept to the window together and pulled back the curtain. 5 figures stood in the yard, just beyond the statues. They weren't moving, at least not at first. Then, slowly, they tilted their heads in unison. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, like marionettes controlled by unseen strings. Their faces were covered with smooth, featureless masks. Elias grabbed the kitchen knife and stormed outside. "Who the hell are you?" he roared. The figures didn't flinch. He took another step forward, knife clenched so hard his knuckles turned white. And then, without a sound, they turned and disappeared into the trees beyond the fence. The police came, took statements, but there was no real evidence. "Could be a prank," the officer said. "Kids messing around. Install some cameras." That didn't sit right with Elias. No kid could move those statues. No kid could move like that. The next morning, fear turned to fury when they stepped outside. Spray-painted in dripping black letters across the garage was a single message: "Go away." Lillian covered her mouth, eyes wide with panic. Owen clung to her leg, whimpering. Elias clenched his jaw, fists trembling. He wanted to fight back, to scream, but who was there to fight? The cameras went up that same day. Every inch of the yard was covered. Elias barely slept, watching the monitors deep into the night. And just like that, the nightmare stopped. No more moving statues. No more masked figures. No more threats. Days turned into weeks. The fear never fully left, but life moved on. Elias wondered late at night if whoever was behind it had simply lost interest. The police never found anything. No suspects, no leads. Just a lingering unease that never faded. But sometimes, in the quiet of early morning, Elias would glance out the window and swear that the statues seemed just a little closer than before. When Owen and Lillian moved into their new home, they thought they had found their dream house. Nestled deep in the countryside, the old two-story farmhouse sat on a vast stretch of land, far from the noise of the city. It was more space than they needed, but they welcomed the change. A fresh start, a peaceful life. For the first few weeks, things were perfect. They spent their mornings sipping coffee on the porch, watching the mist roll over the fields. But as the days passed, strange occurrences began to unsettle them. The lights flickered at odd times, even though the wiring seemed intact. Small items went missing. A spoon here, a book there, but they chalked it up to the chaos of moving in. It was only when Owen, an electrician by trade, decided to inspect the basement that their world began to unravel. The basement was cold, musty, the air thick with dust and damp earth. At first, he saw nothing unusual, just old furniture, rusted tools, and a few forgotten boxes. But as he moved a wooden dresser aside, his breath caught. Hidden behind it was a heavy metal door, industrial grade, thick and imposing. He tried the handle. Locked. That night, he told Lillian about it. "It's probably a storm shelter," she suggested, but her voice held an edge of doubt. The next day, Owen called the previous homeowners, an older couple. When he asked about the door, there was a long silence. Then, the husband's voice, low, uneasy. "Just an old shelter," he muttered. "Nothing important." "But there's a lock," Owen pressed. "None of the keys work." "Leave it alone," the man said, his voice sharp now. "Whatever's in there, it's best left that way." The call ended. Owen stared at his phone, unsettled. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Lillian seemed to sense his unease. "Do you think there's something in there?" she whispered in the dark. "I don't know," Owen admitted. "But I have to find out." His obsession grew. He tried every key in the house, every tool he owned. Nothing worked. Finally, he hired a locksmith. It took over an hour, the lock resisting like it had no intention of being opened. When it finally clicked, the door creaked open, revealing a space that sent a chill through Owen's spine. The room was dimly lit by a single dust-covered bulb. Against the far wall stood a lone chair, directly facing the bare surface, as if someone had sat there for hours, staring into nothing. The walls were covered in old black and white photographs, each marked with strange, unfamiliar symbols. A cot sat in the corner, blankets still rumpled, empty food cans littered beside it. Someone had been living here. Lillian stepped back, her breath shallow. "Owen, we need to leave." He moved deeper into the room, his eyes falling on something even more disturbing. Another door. Smaller, wooden, barely noticeable. He pushed it open, revealing a narrow tunnel that led to an exterior cellar door. A secret entrance. He turned to Lillian, his stomach twisting. "Someone's been in our house." The missing objects, the strange noises, the flickering lights. It all made sense now. The police arrived but found no immediate threats. They noted the hidden entrance, took statements, and assured the couple they'd patrol the area. But Owen and Lillian could see it in their eyes. There was little they could do. Determined to secure their home, Owen chained the door shut, reinforced the locks, and installed security cameras. He told himself it was over. But it wasn't. A week later, the disturbances returned. Late at night, a sharp, rhythmic knock echoed through the house. 3 slow bangs on the front door. Then silence. The dog growled low, pacing anxiously. Owen peered outside. No one. Then the tapping started. Light, deliberate taps against their bedroom window. Lillian gripped his arm, her face pale. Owen rushed downstairs, gun in hand. A shadow moved near the tree line. Then the sound of glass shattering. The kitchen window. He ran outside, heart pounding. 2 figures, dark shapes against the night, bolted into the woods. Owen chased, but they were too fast, disappearing into the trees. He stood there, breathless, feeling the weight of something far more terrifying than he could name. The police escalated their investigation. A report was filed. Patrols increased. But the intruders never returned. Even so, Owen and Lillian never felt safe again. Some nights, they would wake to the creak of floorboards, the whisper of wind against the windows, their bodies tense with the fear that someone, something, was still watching, waiting. And though the house remained theirs, it no longer felt like home. Damon had dreamed of this moment for years. Owning his first home was a milestone, a symbol of independence. He loved the freedom, the solitude, the sense of having his own space. But living alone had its challenges. The house was too quiet. The nights stretched on endlessly, and every creak or gust of wind seemed amplified. His favorite spot quickly became the tiny balcony outside his bedroom. He would sit there with a beer in hand, gazing at the darkened sky, letting the cool night air wash over him. From there, he had a clear view of the house next door. It was old and unkempt, its backyard overgrown with weeds. The windows were dark, the curtains drawn tight. Damon often wondered if anyone lived there at all. Curiosity got the best of him one evening. He walked over, knocked on the door, and waited. Silence. Just as he turned to leave, something flickered behind the curtain. A slight movement, almost imperceptible. The door swung open so suddenly that Damon stumbled back. A frail, elderly woman stood in the doorway. Her eyes, wide, almost unnaturally so, bore into him. Hi, I live next door," he said, forcing a smile. "Just wanted to introduce myself." The woman said nothing for a long moment, her gaze unblinking. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she muttered, "Priscilla." That was all. No greeting, no follow-up, just her name. Damon felt an inexplicable chill. "Well, nice to meet you, Priscilla. Have a good night." She didn't reply, just stood there, her bony fingers gripping the edge of the door. He turned and walked away, resisting the urge to glance back. Something about her made his skin crawl. That night, he sat on his balcony, sipping his beer, trying to shake the unease. His eyes wandered to her house, and then his heart nearly stopped. She was in her backyard, standing perfectly still, staring directly at him. His pulse quickened. He looked away, rubbed his eyes, then glanced back. She hadn't moved, just stood there, her face barely visible in the dim light, watching him. The air felt thick, suffocating. Finally, he went inside, locking the balcony door behind him. The next night, it happened again. But this time, she wasn't in the yard. She was at her window, her face pressed against the glass, watching. Every night after, she appeared in different places, sometimes at the back door, sometimes at an upstairs window, always watching. Damon barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he felt her gaze burning into him. Then, one morning, he found something in his backyard. A sock. A woman's sock, faded and dirty. His stomach turned. She had been in his yard. The idea made him feel sick. His peaceful home no longer felt safe. He considered calling the police, but what would he say? That his elderly neighbor was creeping him out? He tried to dismiss it, but fear gnawed at him. That night, he triple-checked the locks before going to bed. Just as he drifted off, the doorbell rang. Then again, and again. Over and over, rapid and frantic. His heart pounded. He grabbed the bat he kept by the door and peered through the peephole. Priscilla. Her face was twisted with rage, her bony hands hammering the doorbell. Damon's blood turned to ice. He hesitated, but the ringing wouldn't stop. Summoning his courage, he yanked the door open. The moment he did, she lunged at him, a glint of silver flashing in the dim light. A knife. She screamed, her voice shrill and broken. "You took him! Give him back!" Damon barely dodged the blade, grabbing her wrists. She thrashed violently, her strength unnatural for someone her size. He forced the knife from her grip and pinned her to the ground as she sobbed, shaking, mumbling about her son. The police arrived minutes later. As they dragged her away, one of the officers sighed. "She's been unwell for years, lost her son decades ago, keeps thinking someone's taken him." Damon shuddered. He couldn't shake the image of her standing outside, night after night, watching. He tried to live there for a few more months, but sleep never came easy. The house felt tainted. Every creak, every shadow made him jump. The paranoia consumed him. Less than a year later, he sold the house and left. But some nights, even in his new apartment miles away, he woke with a start, the feeling of unseen eyes watching him never quite fading away.